Hi, everyone. This is Patrick, cutting in before the start of the episode to say that this is another interview episode, and it's a really cool one. And I'm just going to read a little bit of the bio from the author that I'm talking to today, Andrea Currie. So, Andrea Currie, Green Turtle Woman, is a mother, writer, and musician who believes that stories are medicine and that healing for ourselves, our relationships with each other and all creatures, and with the lands and waters that sustain us, has never been more important than it is now. She weaves words into pathways to personal and collective self discovery, balancing a critique of colonial systems that continue to oppress us with the generative energy of creating relationships and communities where the teachings of our elders and ancestors are honored by living their wisdom today in the best way we know how. So today I'm talking to Andrea about her new book, Finding Otipemisiwak, The People Who Own Themselves. Andrea, in this book, traces her journey from a child born into a Métis family through a white middle-class childhood that never quite felt right. And I think it's a wide-ranging discussion that really sheds some light on the so-called child welfare system in Canada and elsewhere. As usual, you can find the link to the book if you're interested in reading it in the description below, which I highly encourage. It's a fantastic book, and this discussion was really enlightening. All right, without further ado, let's get to it.
Historia Canadiana is recorded on the unceded lands of the Kanien'kehá:ka First Nation.
Okay, so I'm here today with Andrea Currie to talk about her latest book, Finding Otipemisiwak. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. I've been practicing it to try to be as smooth as possible with it. And I think that we can start off with the most broad question, right? Which is, of course, can you explain to listeners what exactly this book is about?
Sure, Patrick. And thanks for having me. Did a great job on the pronunciation, Otipemisiwak. So I wrote this book as a 60 scoop survivor because I wanted to make a contribution to the conversation that is starting to happen in this country about the 60 scoop. And I felt that, I really didn't want to write my own memoir, life story, I didn't want to just write the narrative of my own experiences. I've been working in Indigenous mental health and healing for over 20 years, and I really wanted to, and I've also been working on my own healing for a long time, so I didn't have the need to write all of that as a catharsis or anything. It's not where I'm at in my own healing. But I did want to use moments of my experience as like a diving board into some of the issues that I think are important for us to talk about when it comes to not just the 60 scoop, but all of the onslaught of harmful colonial interventions made toward and causing harm to Indigenous people since contact. And the 60 scoop is just a part of this whole timeline of things that have happened. So yeah, I know you might want me to just explain a little bit about the 60 scoop. Do you want me to?
It's my next question, just if for people who did not know, because it is a relatively, it's not a new phenomenon by any stretch, but it is, as you were saying, entering the public consciousness more recently than it happened. So if you could explain a little bit what it was for people who may or may not be aware of it, that would be great.
Sure. So the 60 scoop actually started in the 1950s, but was really in its peak during the 1960s and into the mid 70s. But it kind of goes further than that, and has continued up until much more recently. It's the practice within child welfare agencies across Canada. It's called the 60 Scoop in Canada. It's called the Indian Adoption Projects in the States. It's happened wherever colonization has happened, because it's another in an almost endless stream of approaches, genocidal, really, attempts to assimilate. Where actual physical genocide and eliminating us as peoples hasn't worked. Assimilation has been thought by the colonizers to be the next best strategy. And so the 60 scoop was the practice of removing Indigenous children, infants and children like me, from our families, our communities, our culture, our nations, and placing us for foster or adoption in white homes. So I was adopted at birth into a white family, lost all connection to my Métis culture. I'm Red River Métis from the southern Manitoba is my homeland. So that's the what the practice is. And it really, I also like to say that it it came into being as a practice within child welfare in this country once once the residential schools became kind of unacceptable, when the Canadian society decided that residential schools weren't acceptable or they weren't working or whatever, and they started to close. That practice of really taking the Indian out of the child morphed into the child welfare system, and the 60 scoop came into being. And thousands and thousands and thousands of us were removed and lost all connection to a sense of who we are, and our cultural birthright and our teachings and our connections to our ancestors and to our land. It's been devastating for many, many people.
Thank you, first of all, for that surprisingly concise way of explaining the 60 scoop. But I think the part that really stuck out to me, which I think still today people don't necessarily address as much in the public consciousness of the 60 scoop, is just how much it is an extension, as you were saying, of the residential school program. And it is something that I try to emphasize with my own students whenever we talk about these issues in class, is that this is not anything new, unfortunately. And what the Canadian government did, right, with the 60 scoop is basically put a veneer on long existing programs. And I really appreciate you highlighting that in the way that you do, because I do think it's an important thing to remind people of, right? That these are century-long issues that continue, obviously, to this day, just with different names. I don't know if you wanted to add to that, but I just wanted to highlight that. Yeah.
Thank you. I think seeing it of a piece is really important. These are not random, separate actions that have been taken against Indigenous peoples. This is part of a long historical 500-year program to eliminate, assimilate, or subjugate us. And it's ongoing. And in terms of the child welfare piece, I mean, it's ongoing in many, many, obviously around land, economics, healthcare, all kinds of things. But in child welfare, it has morphed now, once the 60s scoop. So around the mid 70s, Indigenous First Nations, and I can't speak to the Inuit experience, actually. That's a gap in my knowledge I need to fix. But in the Métis community also, we created our own child and family services organizations. So there tended to be then, and there is now, an attempt to place children that need, if there's a legitimate need to be outside of their family home, to place them within the community in kinship systems and other forms of care that are more aligned with Indigenous values and teachings. But I think it's really important to mention that it's ongoing, and that what we do understand now, I think there's been some of this in the media too, but maybe some listeners really need to be aware that there's just wildly disproportionate number of Indigenous kids in child welfare throughout this country, and it's really a continuation of the 60 scoop. So the permanent placement into white homes is happening less, but the removal and the numbers of Indigenous children that are in the care of the state is a huge problem, and very complex, and it's probably beyond the scope of this interview to get into it, but there's lots written about that. Mm-hmm. Cindy Blackstock would be one thing for people to Google, one name to Google if people want to find out more about that.
Yeah, absolutely. Or one can even think of, because you mentioned that the 60 scoop moment even ended in the 70s, more or less. From the 70s onward, you still saw instances of forced sterilization, right? So this idea of tying Indigenous lives and bodily autonomy to the explicit, child rearing process is an important part of colonialism that continued way past this 60 scoops moment as well, right? Which I think is...
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think it all circles back to the colonial agenda and of how do you disempower a people? How do you break the spirits of a people, of a nation, of nations in this country? And taking the children, yeah, that's pretty effective. Especially, I grew up for 17 years in a white home. I have experienced the difference in these cultures, and some of us say we walk in two worlds. I don't walk in that world that much anymore, or certainly not as much as I did growing up. But I remember, and I can definitely say that the value that Indigenous peoples place on children is very different than the Eurocentric traditions and the sort of role of children in those kinds of families and communities. And so to remove children is just soul crushing for Indigenous peoples, and to mess with our relationships to our lands, to our homelands. That's the other thing. Like these are things that are integral to being Indigenous. So it is a real dismantling of peoples, and not just individually, but entire communities and nations have been harmed by these practices, and it was intentional, clearly.
Absolutely. And before we get too far into the discussion and away from more the introductory questions, because I do think the element of land being tied to the homeland, right, is something that we want to come back to. But before we get too far, can you explain a little bit the idea behind the title of your book, right, and how it reflects the journey that you describe within the actual text, right? Because I do think it is a striking title, but for some people, they might not know what it refers to. So if you could explain, that would be really great.
Yeah, so ever since finding my culture and my family, which is now, oh my goodness, over 25 years ago, I grew up, being treated and educated as a white kid in the suburbs of Winnipeg. And, there was almost no history of the Métis people taught in school. And so when I found out that this was my history, I had a lot of learning to do. So I've done a lot of reading and research, and I weave some of that into my book. And one of the things I came across was that the Cree nation, the Cree people at the time of the Métis being very healthy and very prevalent in our homeland, sort of prior to the annexation of Manitoba into Confederation. The Cree had a name for the Métis people, and it was Otipemisiwak, and it means the people who own themselves. So they were seeing us as, a little bit different than First Nations, in that we did have that connection to our forefathers, the French or the Scottish, who had come to the territory prior to, any other form of government, and who, I always say it's in my DNA, and the history of my people is to ally and embrace the underdog. And so, we formed alliances with First Nations people, and that became more our identity than the colonial powers that started to come into the territory in fuller force than just the original voyageurs, the like to say the bad boys from Upper Canada who wanted a life in the wilderness. And what it means, what Otipemisiwak means to me, is when I read that, it just resonated with me so profoundly, Patrick, because it was this beautiful nutshell expression of the fact that until I found my Métis culture, my true identity, I did not own myself. If anything, I felt owned by a white suburban family and that lifestyle. So to for me, it became just a very accurate, and to me a beautiful way of expressing that I found my people, but I also found a way to own myself.
It's a beautiful expression of subjectivity, to put it in perhaps more academic terms, but it really it's something that, oh, how could I say it? I don't think I could put it better. I'm not going to even try at this point. I think that's a really good expression, and one again that you don't necessarily see as much. Yes, you're correct, I think, in saying that people more and more are hearing about the Métis communities, right, in schools or otherwise, or at least speaking here from a Quebec-focused perspective, you do hear a little bit more about that. But it's often in very limited terms still. Most of the times that I've heard about it is, at least here in Quebec, through the lens of Louis Riel, right? Which is, fine in some ways, but it doesn't express the whole view. And a term like the one that you use in your title, I think, opens up in such an effective way, right? An understanding of a diverse and very, um, very interesting and vibrant culture, if I can put it that way. So thank you for
Yes.
that. Yeah. I don't know if you wanted to add anything to what I just said, but yeah, I just wanted to say that.
Yeah, no, but I think that's great. I would, and when you mentioned Louis Riel, it just
Yeah,
occurred to me that, history from, we live in this dominant culture in Canada, which
sure.
is defined and shaped by Eurocentric values and history from that perspective. And this is what I really appreciate about the breadth of your podcast programs is, history has been from the Eurocentric tradition, been the story of men and battles.
Yeah,
So it's, Louis Riel is sort of the colonist lens on Métis history.
absolutely.
I'm a huge fan of our great chief Louis, but there is so much more to our history,
Absolutely.
right?
Which is something again that you bring up in the book, and that I'm hoping to get to a little bit later. But getting to some of the earlier points that you mentioned, and I would like to develop a little bit on how you feel the 60 scoop and its perception in public awareness have evolved, because you mentioned earlier that it has gotten more and more into the public consciousness, and I think that's accurate. But can you explain a little bit or go into greater depth about how that change occurred? Like, were there specific instances wherein survivors or activists wanted to elaborate on it? Were there specific policy shifts? Like, how did that change in public consciousness of the 60 scoop occur since the 70s?
So I believe it was just as recently as 2015
Mm,
when Manitoba Premier Greg Selinger did a formal apology, made a public apology about the 60 scoop. I don't think he was leading that so much as responding, but I've worked for very, very closely for over 20 years now with a group of residential school survivors here in Mi'kma'ki, where I live in Wegoma First Nation and more broadly in the whole territory here. And I have to say that both in my personal life, in terms of me finding my voice as a 60s scoop survivor, but also I think in the broader public consciousness, residential school survivors have blazed this trail. There's no question in my mind that we wouldn't be talking about the 60 scoop if the Phil Fontaines and the Nora Bernards and those pioneer, incredibly courageous and tenacious residential school survivors 20 to 30 years ago started insisting that, first of all, compensation be made available for to even in some way try to address the huge losses of the residential school survivors, but also just awareness and education and healing programs, healing activities, gatherings for survivors. So I really feel, and even Selinger's public apology was very much modeled, on Stephen Harper's apology, which followed from then Minister of what was then, I think, that it was still the Department of Indian Affairs, Jane Stewart's apology, which was several years before Harper. So, the consciousness, and then of course there have been apologies around the world in Australia and in other countries. And so, yeah, and we could have a whole
yeah,
critique and debate about apologies, and we won't go there. But I think it was a landmark kind of, it's a marker. And so I really feel that we are, once again, it's our elders who are carrying us, on whose shoulders we're standing. And I have to express and give credit to so many elders who have helped me heal and helped me find my voice. And so for me, the book is about really coming from those teachings, and that mentoring is like those of us who can speak, because not everybody can, not everybody has survived. not every voice is still with us. And yeah, so I guess I just feel a responsibility, very much following the in the footsteps of my incredible role models who've been a lot of residential school survivors I've been very, very blessed to have in my life. And now I find myself a part of two communities because part of the way my story rolled out is that a lot of us 60 scoop survivors are displaced geographically because we became part of a different part of Canadian society that was much more mobile geographically,
Yeah, for
right?
sure.
So white families are much more likely to move across the country for
Yeah.
work and have the same connection to homeland. And, so I ended up on the East Coast because I took off. My adoptive home was not bearable for me. And as soon as it wasn't healthy for me, as soon as I could leave, I did. And so I ended up, after traveling, wandering for a while, I ended up settling in Mi'kma'ki, where I've lived for over 40 years, increasingly spending more time in my homeland in the last 25, since now it means something quite different to me than it meant when I grew up there. But what I was going to say is I'm part of two different communities of 60 Scoop survivors. One specifically Red River Métis in my homeland, which is incredibly precious to me. And I'm also part of a group in Mi'kma'ki now, and I'm actually part of a collaborative team that's offering healing programs and services for 60 Scoop survivors. So our work, and it's interesting. I mean, even the group that I'm a part of in Mi'kma'ki, I have a son who was born after I found my family, and he's very conscious and very outspoken about intergenerational impacts and what's it like to be white passing. And he's contributing in his own ways as a spoken word performer and musician. Um, and some of the other 60 Scoop survivors I know in Mi'kma'ki have young adult children as well. So we're actually developing healing supports and community programming for descendants, which clearly we learned from the residential school survivors. We didn't do that until years into our work with residential school survivors. We started, attending to the needs of descendants,
Mhm.
partly from that learning in the 60 Scoop survivor healing movement, if I can be so bold as to
Yeah,
call
yeah,
it
yeah.
that, the healing activities that are happening across the country. We're including descendants, not just including, but creating descendant specific healing spaces and programs from the get-go, because we learned that from our residential school survivors. So it's very much, and this is so Indigenous, right? We are in a lineage.
Okay.
We are accountable and connected to the seven generations that went before and the seven who are following us. So yeah, it's healing Indigenous style.
Like you're not the first person to mention me this notion of seven generation accountability. Um, but it's every time I hear it, I find it such a beautiful way of expressing the notion of healing and understanding that this involves not only present communities, but historical communities, both past and future, right? Which I find particularly interesting. And another thing that I particularly appreciate about your answer, right, is highlighting how the apologies that have been done in Canada, performed in Canada, if I can use that term, while often emphasized in media spaces, right, and are important in some ways, um, are always, at least in my mind, in my understanding of it, lesser than, if you not necessarily lesser than, but less important than the actual act of community building or community rebuilding that happens not only in Indigenous communities, to take the Canadian example, but across all kinds of decolonial movements that are happening all across the world to this day. And I just wanted to highlight that aspect of your answer is one that I find particularly impactful. Yeah.
Thank you. I think it's very important. I think performed is the correct word
Mm.
unless it is clearly and publicly and consistently in an ongoing way, anchored in action and change. So, and again, not to derail our conversation,
Yeah,
but
yeah.
land acknowledgement is much the same, right? So land acknowledgement is really performance if it isn't, if it doesn't go deeper than that. And I listened to an amazing webinar yesterday, Jay Sewell, a Chippewa artist. I'll just mention it in case listeners want to check it out. He was talking about some amazing visual art he's done. He had an exhibit that just closed at Museum London in London, Ontario. And he talked about, land acknowledgement really needs to shift to land back. Land acknowledgements should include some specific learning and action around the land that people are on and ways that land can be returned. So I will say, just to underline your use of that word performance, I think, yeah, we are well past the time where good intentions are going to suffice.
Leads pretty well actually into the next question I have, which is a little bit more broad, but still tied into what we've been talking about so far. And what are some of the misconceptions, or if main misconceptions, that people still have concerning the child welfare system? Because as you alluded to in an earlier answer, a lot of Indigenous children still end up in this system, and we tend to imagine that the actions and events of the 60s scoop are firmly rooted in the past. But I think one of the things that your book highlights really powerfully is how, again, there's still a lot to change in the child welfare system. So I was wondering if you can elaborate a little bit about what some of those misconceptions are, and how can experiences such as yours help change those misconceptions?
Yeah, I really appreciate that question. I think in some ways, as I was listening to you sketch it out, I think in some ways the term child welfare is a misnomer and a mask. I feel like it was never really about children. I think children have been like the, sort of subsequent quote unquote problem created by other really nefarious kind of social practices, including patriarchy,
Oh yeah.
including capitalism and child labor. I mean, child welfare, as I sketched this out in my book, originated in Canada because of largely orphaned or abandoned, neglected children of abject poverty from the UK who were brought over. I think it was in the 30s, if I'm not mistaken. I'm terrible for dates. I would never make it as a historian, so I
But
am
you're
like
correct. You're, yeah, the
all
1830s. Yeah.
great
Mhm.
respect to you guys that keep that stuff fairly clear. But it was because there were children without people caring for them, without adults in their lives that were brought over to be part of a farm labor force. And then there were issues with their abuse and neglect and their well-being. So there had to be a social service program developed to meet the needs of these children. So it was it you know the origin of child welfare was created by an exploitative capitalist agenda. Like I think it's so important. I'm going to make a quick parallel with the whole issue we're having around the police and alternatives
Mhm.
to policing and defunding the police and police violence. If we look at the history of policing in this country, it was the Northwest Mounted Police, which was a force that was created to put down Indigenous people to make way for westward expansion. Like that's the origin of that institution. If we don't understand the origin of it, everything we do to try to reform it will be band-aid. Like we have to go way back to the roots of these systems. So that's something people need to know about child welfare. The other thing is that, in terms of patriarchy, children, especially in the dominant culture, in European sort of culture, or settler culture in Canada, patriarchy kind of came over with the colonizers, and the idea that women were the property of men, whether that was your spouse or your daughters, for a woman to have a child out of wedlock, even that term wedlock, is that creepy or what? Right? Like I'd love to just get into language. Like I have this fascination in social linguistics, but children born outside of a marriage had to be hidden. And quite often the women who were pregnant with them had to be hidden. All the guys that impregnated these women could kind of, there was no repercussions for them. But it was really about how they were how they damaged the reputation of the men who were supposed to be in control of them. and how men could lose social currency or power and prestige in the community if they had these wayward women attached to their families, not to mention the children. My God, what do you do with these kids? I mean, it's just too much of a problem. They have to be gotten rid of somehow. So we have child welfare, but it's, what part of that is really about children? I really feel like we have been pawns, through, and not just Indigenous kids, but all kids caught up in child welfare have been affected by this value system, and it has been damaging. And I think all adoptees have some psychic wounding that has been completely ignored until recently, and it's just really starting to be. And probably the 60 Scoop is going to contribute to how non-Indigenous adoptees also begin to understand the wounding of separation from family and culture. But so yeah, so I guess I could go on and on about this, but obviously, and Jenny Hayun Wills says this beautifully, as a person who also is a transnational adoptee, where she talked about how there are these dominant narratives of adoption, but they really don't reflect the experiences of the adoptee. So I think I hope my book is part of some increasingly accessible stories that counter these myths about child welfare. And the other thing that's important to understand is that child welfare as a social service in this country, because there are times when children need to be taken from very dangerous situations. There are legitimate times. It's been wildly abused and misused as a practice, but there are times where children need protection. And I think what we know is that this area of social service provision has been incredibly underfunded, and it's connected then to the not valuing of the children, right? So if we don't value children, we're not going to pay childcare workers well. We're not going to fund child welfare agencies appropriately. So what we have is a system that actually isn't necessarily safer for kids. And I think that's really important for people to know.
Yeah.
When children are apprehended, do we really believe that we know for certain they're going to be safer where we place them? I wasn't, and lots of children aren't.
Piggyback off of what you were saying and expand on the linguistic element that you humorously brought up. It's the double-edged sword of paternalism, right? Which is obviously a form of patriarchy. But this idea that these children, Indigenous or, as you mentioned, otherwise, need the protection of the state or some kind of quote unquote like fatherly figure. But at the same time, not actually giving the opportunities or the necessary tools to allow for a healthy growth and relationship with others within their community, right? So thus reinforcing the need, quote unquote, again, for a paternalistic intervention, which is just horribly damaging. And again, goes back to what you were saying about the Northwest Mounted Police, which is an extremely paternalistic institution, historically speaking. So I think that's absolutely well observed on your, and it fits in with the next question also that I was planning, but you already kind of answered it, which is the idea of cultural blindness, right? Of not being necessarily aware of what other people go through from other communities. I don't know if you wanted to expand on that just because you already answered it a little bit, but I just thought that connection was interesting as well.
Well, I think it's an important thing to discuss because it's a huge hurdle. It's a huge rock in the road for those of us that are trying to reclaim our true identity and sense of self, reconnect with in I think a lot of our cases the deepest parts of ourselves that have always been there, and we've had some blood memory kind of moments of awareness of that. But to navigate reclaiming and reconnecting relationships in community and the impact that has on the family and other relationships we've had prior to this process of reconnection, which I have to say is super important to say, especially with I always say it whenever I talk about my book, because my story, though far from perfect in terms of reconnecting with my family and community, has been way more positive than most 60 Scoop survivors. adoption, post-adoption reunion stories have been, and I have to let people know, especially other 60s group survivors, that I'm aware of that my story is not typical. But having said that, I still have had to grapple with the cultural blindness in my adoptive family, in the communities of friends that I was a part of, that I still am a part of. And what I think all I want to say about that is, you know, cultural blindness is an offshoot of colonialism. It's the offshoot because what happens is you have a culture that comes in and dominates. And once that culture, in this case, sort of European settler culture, has dominated for long enough, and in Canada, it really has its roots in British, French to some extent, but the British imperial project around the world has been both geopolitical and cultural, linguistic, the whole bit, right? It's vast, and its tentacles reach into every part of our lives. And the thing is, it becomes so, it's like the air we breathe, it's the water we're swimming in, so it's very hard to be aware of it, right? I think I taught a course on that was an introduction to Indigenous mental health in a master's in counseling program at a university here in Nova Scotia. And it was predominantly, mostly settler students, a few Indigenous students, a few newcomers to Canada. But before we talked about anything in terms of Indigenous worldview, different concepts of self and concepts of health and healing, we had to identify this issue of culture. And so I developed a series of questions to get the settler students to identify what their culture was, that they had a culture, that it shaped everything about their lives, that it shaped their sense of themselves, that it was a part of everything they did, from family rituals, social connection, expectations of life. Like, it just is so. Unless, and that was maybe one of the most important classes in the whole course, because there were these light bulbs going off for these, students, that, if your culture is not threatened and you've never had to defend it, if it surrounds you everywhere, you actually don't have to be aware of it. You don't have to think about it, because it's always accessible to you. It's always reflected back to you everywhere. And so that creates this blindness that I talk about as kind of an epidemic. And I think it's really important, because I really don't think change will happen. Like, I think I've been rethinking the whole process of truth and reconciliation, as many, many Indigenous people have, like, major questions about kind of the prevailing assumptions about all of that. But I think the truth telling has to be settler folks telling the truth about their lives also, their origins, how they came to be where they are, how they came to be able to expect out of life what they expect out of life, and what who had to be exploited and harmed in order for those systems to now be in place, that everybody takes for granted and that are so much a part of everyone's lives. Experienced very differently if you're not part of the Eurocentric settler culture,
Yeah,
but they are part of all of our lives. So I think that I would leave it at that. And I also think it's really important that settler folks take this on. It's not up to Indigenous people to point it out, you know.
absolutely.
I'll leave it at that. I could go on and on, but I try not to.
Um, uh, it is interesting. That idea is one that, again, it merits extra emphasis, right? That there is personal work to be done as well, right? It's not always up to other people to remind you of the work, or remind you of the problems, systemic or otherwise, or individual, perhaps. So yeah, it is a lot
I
of.
jump in here, Patrick, because I
Yes, of
think
course.
what you're saying is super important, and I
Yeah,
want to add an underline to your underline.
please.
And that's, I think people need to, I think settler folks really, especially those of us, those that want to be allies with us and work together to transform relationships in this country. I think the concept of emotional labor needs to be understood. And I've been involved in, as a feminist, in social movements and in anti-racist work, and we can sort of trace this back. It's just like we used to say, it's not women's job to educate men about sexism, right? I mean, this goes way back. This principle is very solid and very clear and logical, right? It's like, to use sort of a Eurocentric way of thinking about it, we didn't create this, and it shouldn't be up to us to guide its dismantling. And I think Indigenous people are really getting more and more clear about that. The idea that I don't want to put my energy into decolonizing settler spaces. I want to put it into strengthening Indigenous ones. I think, we have enough to do to heal and grow in our communities and become healthy and claim our birthright to happiness and health and well-being. Settler folks need to do their own work around, dismantling the structures of dominance and power that keep us stuck.
Absolutely. And your use of the term logical, I think, is quite precise here, because what a lot of settler people operate under is a logic of imperialism. Logic in the structural sense, right? Not that it is any way, shape, or form logical, but under that kind of frame of mind, which is a logic that needs to be dismantled.
Exactly,
Yeah,
because the expectation that Indigenous people will provide, the roadmap
yeah,
is a colonial practice. It's part of that
exactly.
exploitation. It's a continuation of the colonial dynamic, right? So,
Yeah, couldn't have said it better myself. So I see the time fly, and I know we wanted to keep this to an hour, so I'll move on to the next question here. So you've been alluding to this in some of your answers so far. So you allude to some of the practices within Indigenous communities in order to ensure kinship, or even the education or perpetuation of certain forms of cultural knowledge. And I'd be curious if you have any additional thoughts on how some of these practices or ideas concerning kinship can be more appropriately integrated into things like we'll now put it in air quotes, child welfare
yeah.
system in Canada, right? What specific practices might help alleviate some of the traumatic experiences that Indigenous children have faced or continue to face?
Well, I think there are, I mean, this is a huge question, and it's not my field. Like,
Mm,
there are people who are far more knowledgeable and have done more work in this area than I have.
okay.
But I would say things that I know about a little bit about that I think are really worthwhile. Obviously, there are more kinship, foster, and adoption placements happening in Indigenous communities now because we have our own child welfare systems, and those systems are formed on the understanding that it's better for us to care for our own kids, for the children and their relationship to themselves, their clan, their family, their extended family, and their culture, and their land. So I think that is super important, strengthening all of that. I mean, we're just through the Child and Family Caring Society and the work of Cindy Blackstock. We're just trying to like recover from, and we're just at the beginning of actually a time of reparation for the disproportionately lower number of dollars given to Indigenous child welfare agencies compared to settler child welfare agencies in Canada. So we're nowhere near getting where we need to be, which is, additional resources to create alternatives that are necessary now because of our colonial history. But, so I think open adoptions is another one. I think the secrecy around adoption, again, that's part of that paternalistic patriarchal practice of protecting the adoptive, like the birth family's reputation, protecting the adoptive families, from having to kind of embrace in an open way what it means to care for the children of another family. So open adoptions, I think, are something that we need to become, and there's skills involved in that. It's complicated.
Yeah.
It's almost like everybody's family just extends. Like, what about it, forming kinship ties in open adoptions so that the child's sense of family is just much bigger, you know? And the other thing is Janine Carriere's work. She's now at UVic, I believe. She might originally be from my area. She might be a prairie person, but I know she's working out of UVic, I believe, or certainly has in the past. And she talks about the idea that if it is ever necessary for an Indigenous child, or really this could apply to a child of any culture, being placed in the family of another culture, that the whole family becomes bicultural. So the whole family takes on connection and relationship and involvement in the community and culture of the adopted child who's expected to come in. So that takes assimilation right off the table, right? We're now talking about the whole family becoming bicultural and embracing. So I think this is how we dismantle othering, right? If we're all embracing the other, there's no other left,
Exactly. Yeah.
you know? So yeah, those are just some thoughts, but again, there's lots more for people to explore if they're interested in that.
For sure. And before we close up for this conversation, I do want to talk about some of the ways that you write the text, right? And this is just my personal literature student nerd coming out here. So there's two things I want to address specifically in relation to that. Um, and first is the way that you use rivers and waterways as a central symbol in your work. So can you elaborate perhaps why such symbols would be important for the narrative that you're expressing in your book?
Yeah, thank you for asking that question. As I came to understand my people more, the Red River
Mm,
Métis, and how rooted in the land, how rooted might not be the right word because we were kind of nomadic on the plains, but how connected, like the deep relationships to the land and to the rivers. Um, when I read this stuff, when I learn from elders, when I learn from hanging out with my family, it's like taking a drink after being in a desert for a huge amount of time, like just an indescribable thirst being quenched. And so there's something, it just kind of really speaks to my soul, touches me at the level of my spirit. And then when I went to weave sort of different threads of my story together into this book and different threads of essay and poetry and my younger brother's story, the rivers were there too, because I realized that, I mean, I grew up in a white suburb and our connection to the land was very middle class, like camping trips or a cottage or, it just wasn't, and it was very much the Euro-Christian ideal of, there was some great wilderness ethics that I learned in my family, and I'm grateful
sure.
for that. But it was very much, this is ours to look after. This is ours. We have, that Euro that Christian kind of thing of you are lords of all you survey, like you are, the stewards even of this
Yeah.
land. Like steward is now being reclaimed in some places by indigenous people, but I still have a bit of a settler
So
reaction. Like I
interesting. Mm,
react to it as a bit of a settler concept because I think it
yeah.
comes from. So what I realized was I did not grow up with that connection to land, but for some reason, I mean, blood memory, I'm thinking. I mean,
Mm,
this is all, some of this is very mystical, right? It's not all
yeah.
accessible to conscious awareness and logic, but I always felt drawn to the rivers and I always had access to the rivers. Growing up in Winnipeg, there's always a river not too far away. And I had pretty significant relationships with especially the Assiniboine growing up. So that's why it's in the book, because it's
Yeah.
so important.
Absolutely. And just to come back briefly to that one, I understand your objections to something like a term like rooted because of its implications, but I still think it is an interesting one to consider because when we think about how so many plants, say mushrooms, have root systems that go for kilometers, right,
Mm.
around them, and sometimes these root systems are interweaved with each other, right? It's not just one individual plant; it's a whole system of plants that are connected over miles.
Yeah.
I think the metaphor still holds, especially to what
Love
we've
it.
been talking about. Mm,
There are plants like that, like strawberries and certain where the roots go out in runners.
yeah, yeah,
And
yeah,
so
yeah.
I think of my ancestors as being like that. And one of my brothers in my birth family who grew up on a ranch, and like when I say rooted, I think of him as like sprouting from the land, like he's so connected to the land. It's like he just grew up, when I would see him in his element in a hayfield, I just feel like he's just part of it. He's just like one of the things that grew here, and he did grow up there, in his own adoptive family, another 60 scoop placement. But he grew up on the land, and now he's, we're considering looking at land somewhere else in the province, but he still has this incredible sense of land, like he anyway. So yeah, I agree. It isn't geographic. It doesn't have to be in one place to be kind of rooted in, just, if we use that term to mean just really deeply connected.
Exactly. Yeah. And the other thing I wanted to mention as far as literary elements are concerned is your your refusal to stick to like one form of writing throughout your text. I don't know if it's a refusal. I don't know if that's the right term, but your engagement with multiple forms of writing is perhaps more accurate. Where you'll write things like poems at the start of certain sections or chapters, and then continue on with more formal prose. Um, More formal prose that, in its sense, is still poetic, and sometimes spiritual, like you were saying. And I'm wondering if there was any kind of purpose or logic or intention behind your incorporation of different types of writing like that. Did you have a particular idea going into the writing of this book that you would want to channel certain forms of writing for certain ideas?
I had no plan. Um,
Wonderful.
there, there would have been no clear intention, but I
Uh,
think the purpose revealed itself to me. I
okay.
think it, I think it was just natural to me because I do write in different ways, and so that's just how things came. And then when I reflected on it, as it was taking that shape, or lack of shape, whatever it is, it's using very different genres and attempting to weave them together in some way. Couple things. One is that I think the poems tend to, when I look back, I think I mostly used them, I mostly wrote them when I was trying to express something that was pretty mystical, like very deep and not really belongs somewhere outside of the cognitive rational realm to be really understood in the way that I was feeling and sensing those things. So that was one thing that I noticed as things were coming out and taking some kind of shape. The other thing is that I realized that, as because I read other Indigenous authors widely, and I think about Alicia Elliott, who combined memoir and essay. I think about Joshua Whitehead, who's one of my, I mean, these are all people who've been huge influences on me. Leanne Batasamasak Simpson. Form is like I think it's, to me, I think it's important for us as we're finding our voices as Indigenous writers to make it clear that our creations in writing may not fit into these literary conventional categories, and that's our storytelling is very circular. I'm always doing that. And you noticed in this interview, I will be starting to talk about something, then I take a little detour and I come back most of the time. Sometimes I forget where I started, but mostly I can come back and pull it together. But I I am hoping that I can count myself and be proud to be part of an emerging community of Indigenous writers that are challenging what I would consider colonial forms, and that this is what a book looks like, and this is what a poem is, and this poems belong in poetry books, and even my agent and my publisher. I mean, it seems to be a temptation for people to refer to my book as strictly memoir, which I would have to say it isn't. There's a ton of things about my life that aren't in there, and I don't want to write memoir, but there was a place for memoir in there in the mix. And my agent said, okay, really, this is narrative nonfiction. So I think maybe the language will catch up, or maybe not. Maybe we don't need to have new categories. Maybe we just need to say we can write without feeling bound and constricted by definitions of different kinds of writing.
Absolutely. Two things to say on that as we wrap up. First, thank you for all of the recommendations. There are some that I was aware of other authors. I'm saying here. Some I was aware of, others that I was writing down as you were talking because I want to look more into their ideas. And second, to come back to your idea of poetry, this is a quote that I constantly come back to in my own life. One of my professors when I was doing my undergrad mentioned that poetry was something that you write or engage with, because if you don't write or engage with poetry, you're going to sound insane trying to actually express it in any other way, shape, or form. And I think your answer kind of gets to that idea, right? Where you kind of channeled that poetic form naturally in order to express something, like you said, completely sometimes irrational, right? Or that doesn't fit within our conventional notions of rationality. And I just wanted to highlight that.
Great. Wonderful. Can I throw a couple more authors in that I just want to
Please.
give
Yeah, absolutely.
Matthew James Weigel, his book White Mud Walking, which is also using the physical form of a book to disrupt the way we understand what it is to read a book or to write a book. And Billy Ray Balcourt does the same too. Like there's a lot more, but those are ones that are very, very dear to my heart.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. So as we're wrapping up, I always like to launch to authors one last question, which you might have heard because I know you listened to the interview I did with Katerina. But I always like to ask my authors one simple question, which is, what did I not ask, or what did we not have time to talk about in this interview? And what is the answer to that question?
Patrick, nothing is jumping out that I really wanted to talk about that I didn't get a chance to. And I know I did say this to you already, but I'll say that on the recording is that your questions were very well thought out, and it was just a real pleasure to chat with you.
Wonderful. Thank you very much to you for your time and for this lovely, lovely book, which I highly encourage readers to check out. I'm sure it is available anywhere you can find books. If not, you can buy it directly at the publishers. But yes, thank you very much for your time. And is there anywhere that you would like readers to be able to contact you in case they have any questions or anything like that, or it would be directly through the publicist, I imagine?
Directly through the publicist is best. I'm a bit old school and I don't have a web presence or I'm trying. I will eventually develop some social media abilities, but I'm not really there yet. So anyway, the publisher will get people in touch with me for sure.
Yeah, wonderful. So thank you again. And yeah, I highly encourage people to check out the book.
Marketing is hard. But I'll tell you a little secret. It doesn't have to be. Let me point something out. You're listening to a podcast right now, and it's great. You love the host. You seek it out and download it. You listen to it while driving, working out, cooking, even going to the bathroom. Podcasts are a pretty close companion. And this is a podcast ad. Did I get your attention? You can reach great listeners like yourself with podcast advertising from Libsyn Ads. Choose from hundreds of top podcasts offering host endorsements, or run a pre-produced ad like this one across thousands of shows to reach your target audience in their favorite podcasts with Libsyn Ads. Go to libsynads.com, that's LIBSYN, ads.com today.